Joining me now is a recipient of the National Humanities Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, who is the founder, executive chairman, and now retired CEO of C-SPAN. He also served as a commissioned officer in the United States Navy. On behalf of myself and Brandeis University, Brian Lamb, thank you for taking the time to join the program today.
William, pleasure. Nice to see you.
Before we dig into C-SPAN and the multimedia journalism industry, can you provide our audience with brief contextual information about what C-SPAN is, what do the initials stand for, and its mission?
C-SPAN stands for Cable Dash Satellite Public Affairs Network, which 45 years ago seemed to make sense in a world of acronyms and letters and all that stuff. And it combined the use of cable television with the satellite, which made the difference. The satellite was everything because it was a cheap way, relatively cheap way of transmitting material all over the United States with a public affairs network. And our mission is very simple, very simple. Put a camera in front of public events and let people see them from beginning to end, including the House sessions and the Senate sessions and a lot of other stuff.
We'll talk about politics later, but born and raised a Hoosier, can you discuss the impact of college radio on your aspirations for broadcast journalism?
When I was at Purdue University, I worked not full time in the summer. I did, but on the weekends as an announcer, basically a disc jockey at the local commercial radio station, WASK, and that was incredibly important to me. Gave me a chance to interview. We had lots of stars come to Purdue, put on shows. Gave me a chance to understand how the news business worked on radio, and it was an important beginning for my career.
Are there particular guests that joined your program?
Well, I had to tape it. Probably my biggest memory would either have been Nat King Cole, who was hugely popular at the time in about 1960, or the Kingston Trio, which another group. I've asked young people today if they've ever heard of the Kingston Trio, and they say, have no idea. So, I don't tend to bring it up so much, but Nat King Cole still has some visibility. And that was, for me, a very memorable time.
When you look back on your military service, are there particular circumstances where you can attribute that experience to achieving success at C-SPAN?
Oh, I think my Navy experience was probably number one in everything I've ever done, primarily because they gave me responsibility at a 22-year-old time in my life that was far beyond you could get anywhere else. After college in 1963, I reported to a ship after officers candidate school down in Norfolk, Virginia. And once I got to the ship, basically got to do everything you could do as an officer, and you grew up pretty fast, or you crashed your ship into the side of another ship, and it was just that simple. It was a very, very important time. Learned a lot about leadership from people that had done it for years. I can go on, but won't.
What I When I was doing research, and I mean you've talked about this in the past, what was your relationship with Defense Secretary McNamara?
None. I worked in the Pentagon in the public affairs office. He was on, I think, the third floor. He and I had no relationship at all. He was the big guy, I was the little guy. But during the time that I was there, I got involved in some things that he at least was aware of. And they weren't particularly, and they weren't a big deal, but in his eyes, he wasn't terribly excited about it. After years later, when I was at C-SPAN, I interviewed him for his book, and then another interview later, which I found to be very useful in trying to understand him, because he got a lot of the criticism for getting us in and keeping us in the Vietnam War.
Where did the idea originate to design a cable network focused on the deliberations of the U.S. Congress?
I started out thinking that there was an opportunity in the new technologies back in 1976, 77 to do public affairs programming beyond what the networks were doing. Public Affairs Network, public affairs on NBC, ABC, and CBS has really not changed in 45 years. They've all had the same Sunday shows. They've expanded them to an hour.
The personalities have changed.
That's it. Otherwise, it's the same thing. Actually, it's not as penetrating today as it was back then, because guests back then would only appear on one network on one Sunday. But my thought on all this, and especially when I was in the Pentagon and had come from a small town in Indiana, is there's room for a lot more. And so out of that, without knowing what I was doing, I went to the executives in the cable television business who really didn't understand programming. They had been in the business of stringing cables from one pole to the next and providing over-the-air television in places that couldn't get it. And I made a proposal to them, and out of a room of 40 people, one guy came up and said, "I think you got a good idea. Let's see if we can make it happen." It wasn't a steady line from that moment until the time it happened, but without guys like Bob Rosencrans and others in those days, we would have never started C-SPAN.
When you say that the television networks have not changed, what about the companies that provide television? So we're talking about Cox or Xfinity, whatever it may be. Has that changed?
Completely.
And how so?
Well, NBC was owned by RCA Victor. NBC, now it's owned by Comcast. ABC was owned by Cap Cities. And before that, it was an original company. It's now owned by Disney. And CBS was the Tiffany network. It was owned by Bill Paley, and it was a traded stock, but it's now combined with Viacom as a big company that owns a lot more than just CBS television, and has really nothing to do with the early CBS.
What is C-SPAN doing to adjust to recent changing viewer habits and challenges?
I'm what's the term they use for an old goat like me? I'm a barnacle on the bottom of the vessel, and so I am not connected to the new world like you are. I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on Facebook, but the network is. And interestingly enough, back in 1996, we began streaming everything on the internet free of charge that was underwritten by the cable television industry at the time. So we were ahead of the game in many respects. But we're there everywhere. Whether we are interesting to people is another question, because it's a strange world we live in when TikTok's number one. And people just want short 15-second entertain me type videos. So we're swimming in a sea of thousands and thousands of opportunities. So it's a completely different world, and we're trying to keep up with it and be relevant as things change dramatically.
Do you find that did you find that there were added challenges due to the pandemic, or even going back, more than a decade now, to the 2008 financial crisis? In the sense that, again, because most of your viewers are the average American and their households and how they choose to spend their money.
I don't know how many years it was, I'd guess 8, that people started cutting cable. And it was based on two things. One, the expense. And somebody had 250 channels and they were paying $150 a month, and they said, "I don't need those. I'd only watch 5 of them." That was tough. And the bills kept getting larger and larger. And the second one was the streaming services. I remember how aghast, that's not the right word, I was when Netflix was able to be streamed on the internet. I thought, wow, this is going to change everything. And it did. Those two things, some of it started back in the mid 2008 period, but it was exacerbated during the pandemic. A couple of things happened during the pandemic. One is we had to go to Zooms to get programming. And sometimes it left a lot to be desired. The quality stunk. But it helped us survive during that period. The other thing is people stayed home. And we showed to ourselves that we could operate these networks. We have 3 of them and a radio station, basically from home base. So a lot has changed. The product's by and large the same, but it doesn't look the same as it did before the pandemic.
In 2000, you sent a letter to then Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist requesting C-SPAN access to provide coverage for Florida's presidential recount. Earlier this month, the Supreme Court announced it was reopening the courtroom to the public after closure due to the pandemic. Will you ask the Supreme Court again for access?
I think we're done asking them. They know. There are new forces that are at work, and I have to give the Chief Justice credit. He doesn't seem to be interested in television, but because of the pandemic, he allowed us to carry, and others, the live proceedings of the court. And when they came back in person this year, he said, I'm going to continue it. That's a very big plus. It's a slow process. Whether or not the court ever goes to television is anybody's guess. It's not going to hurt them. As you know, the court is controversial and television isn't going to make a difference. But they don't want it yet. And a lot of that depends on the Chief Justice. And maybe he'll see the way clear that to show that no matter how angry people are about some of the decisions, the court members themselves get along.
As we talk about political polarization, today an increasing number of Americans cite fake news and biased journalism, among other things, as the reasons why they no longer choose to consume news from verified publications, instead seeking different options. What is your message to those who are reluctant to read, watch, and listen to trusted news organizations?
Well, if you want to be an informed citizen, you've got to read a lot. As a matter of fact, reading is the best way to learn. What we do in television just adds a human picture to it. And it's important, but not as important as reading. I am so old-fashioned, I still do this.
He's pointing to a newspaper right now.
I read the hard copy every day, and I'm going to miss it someday because it's going away. But it's important for people. I mean, this is not an unusual time in our history. There have been so many more severe times where, during the wars, censorship, Lincoln put aside habeas corpus, times like that, the Alien Sedition Act. People have always been suspicious of the media. Right now, it's strong, but I keep, it is preaching to young people in particular, don't get caught only reading one side. If you don't know what the other side that you don't believe in is saying, then you really don't understand it. So it's just important. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to follow it. You don't have to vote for it, but just know that there's a whole world out there that you don't know anything about. And that's why every day I'm going back and forth constantly. I just showed you the Wall Street Journal. Let's try the Washington Post. I mean, and online, there's so much you haven't got time to look at it all.
Do your values and your beliefs, per se, about journalism and understanding both sides, does that tie into, again, your motives for creating C-SPAN? Again, for those who don't know, a bipartisan network that covers both chambers, that covers what is happening on Capitol Hill, but also at the White House and other government proceedings?
There are a lot of journalists that aren't going to agree with what I'm going to say, is that journalism has always been biased. I know that. I watch it. I don't get as upset about the bias as I do about journalists saying we're not biased and trying to sell the idea we're objective, we're fair. Sometimes you are objective and fair, but other times you are making a decision to cover a story because of your personal instincts. What we try to do here, and I wouldn't call us an over-the-moon success.
And again, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan.
Absolutely. But I wouldn't call us a success with the public some of the public, because a lot of people don't want to watch the other side. They don't want to hear it. I just felt that if we kept our cost low, we could provide a service for people when they wanted it, and it would always be there for them. And probably the best thing we've ever done is create a video archive available to the public free of charge, which means that everything that happens here on the network, you can call up later and watch it. And that's a pretty good, I mean, the cable industry went along with that idea, and that's a pretty good gift.
After working in television, writing books, and utilizing audio platforms, including radio and podcasts, how has your interpretation of information dissemination changed since C-SPAN's inception?
There's a huge amount of information available, including, I'll just give you one example. The New York Times used to be the newspaper of record. They would publish speeches. They don't anymore. They may tuck it away on their digital site, which is very valuable. But most recently, Putin made a speech which was worth everybody spending some time reading, clearly showing his anger and his view of history. And I didn't want to watch him. I wanted to read him. And so I could call him up immediately on the internet. I don't think I need to give any more examples than that, because anything that happens almost in our society is available on the internet within minutes. And there's a bad side of the internet, but there's a bad side to everything. But there's a fabulous side to all of this. And I use it every day.
When you look back at President Bush awarding you the National Humanities Medal in 2003 and Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2007, how do you think those awards demonstrate the success you and C-SPAN have achieved?
I should be far more gracious than I'm going to be. What I mean by gracious, just say, oh, they were wonderful, and I was really glad to get them. But I've been in Washington too long. This is all those awards mean. Somebody in the position of the decision making thought what we had done was valuable enough to try to put an award on it. It's that whole system of awards is very political, not partisan political, but people in politics can make that decision. I know where they came from. I know how it happened. I'm grateful that people thought they were of some value. But to be honest with you, William, and I don't want to sound negative, I don't think about it very often, because for everyone that got the Humanities Medal in my group, there's 7,000 others that would be worthy of it. And you just can't get carried away with that. The only thing that really matters to me, and always will matter to me, is if people use this network to improve their information.
A number of Brandeis students have expressed interest in pursuing careers in business, politics, and/or journalism. What advice do you have for them?
Get on with it. Brandeis has a great reputation, having a lot of smart students, as do a lot of universities. You'd think if you were in my place, where I read a lot of books and a lot of articles, that it's only Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But there are 4,000 schools of higher learning with brilliant people in them. And the trick is getting an interest that you feel strongly enough to go pursue. It sounds like a cliche, because it is, but that's the way it has to happen. And if you're interested, put your hand up. Put your hand up. I just had a cup of coffee with a young lady that I had in a class that I teach at Purdue. And it was a kick, because she comes from a little tiny town outside of my hometown, which is small, of Lafayette, Indiana. And she has pursued scholarships and currently is a State Department intern. And there's the only one reason she's any of those places. I want to do that. It works.
You talk about the Go Get It initiative and the mindset that, again, nothing's going to come to you, that you do have to go out and pursue it and do it instead of always talking about it. Can you touch upon about how you became interested and how you learned to develop this business, considering that, you didn't go to business school, that you were in the military, but that you spoke to lawmakers and proposed this idea?
This is going to sound odd. I was never a very good student, and I know why. I probably, in those days, they never diagnosed people with what I have. It's probably ACDC of something like that. I mean, my attention span can be short. So I wasn't a very good studier. And I think that how I made up for that is that I was always saying, can I do that? Can I do that? And it was the hands-on experience. And Purdue was a good education, state school, uh, really had everything any other schools had. And fortunately or unfortunately, I did have to sign up for the service or get drafted. The Vietnam War was horrible, but I signed up for the Navy and they let me in, and I did very medium type work in the school part of it. And then I said, let me do the job. And I made up for it by giving full time and attention to doing the specific job that they wanted me to do. And I'd put my hand up and say, I want to go do that job. And you can make up for the fact that you may not be the single best student in your class by volunteering to do a job that maybe somebody else doesn't want to do. And that's where what I've been able to do comes from. It's just that because I wasn't a terrific student, I had to work a little harder getting inside any organization and getting a job and spending, these are cliches, getting up earlier, stay up later, research, find out the information, ask questions. The thing that probably has made me survive is I ask people a lot of questions. And it works. It just works. You learn, and it's fabulous.
Mr. Lamb, thank you again for taking the time to join the program today and providing a critical perspective.
William, thank you for inviting me. Good luck to the Brandeis students. You have a great name in history. If you don't know who Brandeis was, you better get a book.
Thank you.